You made a decision yesterday. Maybe it was last week. Doesn't matter. You collapsed it. You thought that's what manifesting means. You choose it, you claim it, you collapse it into reality. Decisiveness, clarity, commitment. That's what all the teachers say, right? Get clear, make the decision, and watch it materialize. But here's what you actually did. You locked yourself into the lowest probability pathway that was available at that exact moment. The reality you wanted. It needed 3 more days in superposition, maybe a week. The quantum field was still organizing, still computing, still pulling together the elements that would have given you something 10 times better than what you forced into existence. But you collapsed it early. And now you're stuck with the version that was barely formed. I know this sounds backwards. Everything you've been taught says the opposite. Decide and commit. Choose your reality. Claim it with certainty. The universe rewards the bold, the decisive, the people who know exactly what they want and aren't afraid to declare it. And look, there's truth in that framework, but it's incomplete, dangerously incomplete. Because it's missing the one variable that determines whether your decision creates reality or destroys it: timing. Let me show you what I mean. Think about a business decision you made recently. Maybe you decided exactly how your income would increase. You got specific. I'm going to land this type of client at this price point by this date. You wrote it down. You visualized it. You told yourself this is how it's happening. Decisive, clear, committed, and then what happened? The energy went flat, or you hit immediate resistance, or the path you chose felt like pushing a boulder uphill. Meanwhile, there was this other thing at the edge of your awareness, this opportunity that didn't fit your specific plan, and you ignored it because you'd already decided. You'd already collapsed the wave function into your predetermined outcome. You missed what the field was actually organizing. This is the mistake that's costing you everything. And it's rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of how quantum mechanics applies to consciousness and reality creation. Because yes, observation collapses the wave function. Yes, the observer effect is real. Yes, consciousness does interact with the quantum field to produce material reality. But the question nobody's asking is, when should that collapse happen? Not can it happen, not should it happen eventually, but when. In quantum mechanics, particles exist in superposition, multiple states simultaneously. An electron isn't here or there, it's in a probability cloud of possible locations until you measure it. The moment you measure it, the wave function collapses. Superposition ends. The particle appears in one specific location, one specific state, and you can never get back to that moment before measurement. You can't uncollapse it and let it evolve further. It's done. Your desired reality works the same way. Right now, it exists as a probability amplitude in what physicists call phase space. It's not nothing. It's not just a fantasy in your head. It's a real mathematical object with real properties. And one of those properties is that it evolves over time. The probability amplitude grows. It accumulates coherence. It entangles with other probability fields. It pulls in the particles and circumstances and synchronicities that will eventually form the material, manifestation you want, but only if you don't collapse it too early. When you make that decisive choice, when you claim it with certainty, when you lock in the specific how and when and who and where, you're performing a measurement. You're collapsing the wave function. And you're collapsing it based on the probability distribution that exists right now in this moment, with the limited information and circumstances currently available. You're not getting the version that was forming. You're getting the version that barely exists yet. Think about it like this. You're watching a Polaroid photo develop. You can see the outline forming. There's something there. And you get excited, you get impatient, and you grab it and try to speed up the development by shaking it or exposing it to light. And what happens? The image stops developing. It freezes wherever it was. You get a blurry, half-formed version of what would have been a clear, complete picture if you just waited for the chemical process to finish. That's what you're doing when you collapse too early. The quantum field has a timing mechanism. Probability amplitudes don't just sit there static. They oscillate, they build, they reach points of maximum coherence where the likelihood of manifestation is exponentially higher than it was 3 days ago. But you have to let that process complete. Here's how you know if you've done this. You made a firm decision and immediately felt resistance. Not the kind of resistance that comes from being off path, but the kind that feels like friction, like you chose too soon. Or you claimed your goal with absolute certainty and the energy went dead, flat. You lost the momentum you had before you decided. Or you set a specific deadline for how something would manifest, and suddenly the circumstances got harder, not easier. Obstacles appeared that weren't there before, or here's a big one. You felt like you had to lock in your choice or you'd lose it. There was this urgency, this sense that if you didn't decide right now, if you didn't commit right now, if you didn't collapse it into a specific form right now, the opportunity would slip away. That urgency? That's not intuition. That's your nervous system forcing a premature collapse because uncertainty feels dangerous. And I get it. We're wired for certainty. Our survival mechanisms hate unresolved possibilities. The brain wants to know, is this safe or not? Is this happening or not? Give me a yes or a no so I can stop using energy on this question. And so we collapse, we decide. We force clarity where the field is saying, not yet, I'm still computing, give me time to organize this properly. But here's what makes this even more insidious. The self-improvement world has weaponized this tendency. Get clear or get nowhere. The universe rewards specificity. Declare it with certainty. Decide and the how will appear. All of that sounds empowering. It sounds like you're taking control of your reality. But what you're actually doing is interfering with a quantum process that knows more than you do. The field has access to information you don't. It can see probability pathways you can't perceive yet. It knows which synchronicities are lining up, which people are about to enter your reality, which circumstances are shifting in ways that will create the perfect conditions for what you want. But only if you let it finish organizing. Only if you hold the possibility in superposition long enough for the probability amplitude to peak. When you force the collapse early, when you decide exactly how it has to happen based on what you can see, right? Now, you're overriding the field's intelligence with your limited perspective. You're taking a quantum computer that's solving a complex optimization problem and shutting it down mid-calculation because you think you already know the answer. And then you wonder why the outcome feels forced. Why it's less than what you sensed was possible. Why it required so much effort. Let me give you a concrete example. You're building a business. You need income. You can see one clear pathway, a specific type of client or project. And you decide, this is it, this is how the money comes. You collapse the superposition. You commit. You take action toward that one pathway. And maybe it works. Maybe you get that client. But what you don't see is the other probability that was forming, the introduction that was about to happen, the opportunity that was organizing in the background, the pathway that would have been 3 times more profitable and half the effort. But you collapsed too early. You chose the visible option before the better option became visible. This isn't theoretical. This is the actual mechanism behind why forcing doesn't work the way allowing does. Why people who are less attached to the outcome seem to get better results. It's not just about vibration or energy, though that's part of it. It's about keeping the wave function in superposition long enough for the probability field to fully organize. It's about timing your collapse for maximum coherence instead of minimum anxiety. And this is where it gets uncomfortable. Because if premature collapse is the problem, and if your nervous system is constantly trying to force early collapse for the sake of certainty, then the question becomes, how do you navigate reality without collapsing everything through sheer anxiety? How do you maintain superposition when your biology is screaming for resolution? You need to understand something that nobody talks about in manifestation circles. The observer effect doesn't mean stare at your goal until it appears. That's not what observation means at the quantum level. In fact, what you think is observation, what you've been taught is holding the vision, is actually something completely different. Something that doesn't create reality. Something that collapses it into the worst possible version, and that's measurement under interference. But we'll get to that in the next chapter. For now, just notice. Notice when you feel the urge to decide, to lock it in, to collapse the possibility into a specific form, because the uncertainty is uncomfortable. Notice when you're about to choose based on what's visible right now, instead of what's forming just beyond your current perception. Notice when you're forcing clarity because you think that's what manifestation requires. Because the decision you make in that moment, the choice to collapse or to wait, that's what determines whether you get the shadow of your desire or the fullness of it. And most of you have been choosing shadows your entire life without realizing it. Not anymore. The observer effect doesn't mean stare at your goal until it manifests. That's not observation. That's measurement under anxiety. And measurement under anxiety collapses possibilities into survival states, not desired states. Let me explain what I mean. You've heard about the double-slit experiment, right? Electrons behave like waves when you're not watching them, creating an interference pattern. But the moment you observe which slit they go through, they behave like particles. The wave function collapses. The observer changes the outcome just by observing. And every manifestation teacher took that principle and ran with it. You're the observer. Hold the vision. Watch it constantly. Put it on your vision board and look at it every day. They turned observation into a practice of obsessive focus. Keep your attention on the desired reality. Don't look away. Don't doubt. Keep observing it into existence. But here's what they missed. There's a difference between neutral observation and emotionally charged measurement. A massive difference. And that difference determines whether you're collapsing the wave function into higher probability states or lower ones. In quantum mechanics, observation is actually a form of interaction. When you observe something, you're not just passively looking, you're exchanging information with it. You're entangling with it. And the state you're in when that entanglement happens matters. It changes the outcome of the collapse. Think of it this way. When a physicist measures an electron in a lab, they're doing it from a neutral state. They don't care which way the spin goes. They're not emotionally invested in the particle being spin up instead of spin down. They're just measuring what is. That's observation. That's the observer effect working cleanly. But when you observe your desired reality, when you visualize, when you affirm, when you check on your progress, are you neutral? Are you detached from the outcome? Or are you measuring from a place of need? From a place of, please let this be real, please let this be happening, please let me not be wasting my time. That's not observation. That's interference. And interference doesn't just collapse the wave function, it collapses it into the state that matches your frequency at the moment of measurement. If you're measuring from anxiety, you collapse into anxious outcomes. If you're measuring from lack, you collapse into continued lack. If you're measuring from desperation, you get desperate circumstances. This is why holding the vision backfires for most people. They think they're observing their desired reality into existence. But what they're actually doing is constantly measuring whether it's here yet, checking, confirming, validating. And every time they check, they're collapsing the wave function from a state of not yet, which reinforces not yet as the dominant reality. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. You want more money? So you visualize wealth. You see yourself with the bank account balance you want. You feel into the abundance. And then what do? You check your actual bank account. You measure. And in that moment of measurement, you're not in the frequency of abundance. You're in the frequency of comparison, of lack, of this isn't here yet. And that frequency, that's what collapses into your reality, or you're building a business. You hold the vision of success. Clients flowing in, revenue growing, impact expanding. You spend 20 minutes every morning visualizing this. And then you check your emails. You measure. Are there new clients, new inquiries? And when there aren't, what happens to your internal state? Disappointment, doubt, frustration, and you just measured from that frequency. You just told the quantum field, "This is my state," and the field responded by collapsing possibilities that match disappointment, doubt, and frustration. This is the loop that keeps people stuck for years. They think they're manifesting. They think they're using the observer effect. But they're actually performing hundreds of micro-measurements throughout the day, and every single one of those measurements is collapsing the wave function from a frequency of lack. They're constantly confirming what isn't here instead of allowing what's forming. Here's the distinction you need to understand. True observation, the kind that creates reality cleanly, happens from the state of already having. Not pretending to have, not visualizing having. Actually being in the internal state of someone for whom this is already real. And from that state, observation doesn't feel like checking. It doesn't feel like measuring. It feels like neutral witnessing. When you observe from the state of already having, there's nothing to confirm. There's no anxiety about whether it's working. There's no desperation about timing. You're just aware of the reality as it unfolds, the same way you're aware that your next breath will come. You don't check whether breathing is working. You don't measure your respiratory system every 5 minutes to make sure oxygen is still entering your lungs. You just breathe. And observation from having works the same way, but observation from needing to have. That's measurement under interference. That's your nervous system in survival mode, trying to confirm whether the threat of lack is still present. And when your nervous system is measuring, it's not measuring, "Is my desired reality here?" It's measuring, "Am I safe yet?" And the answer, when you're in that frequency, is always no, which collapses the field into circumstances that confirm no. Not safe yet, not here yet, not enough yet. The quantum field doesn't interpret the content of your thoughts. It responds to the frequency of your observation. You can visualize wealth all day long, but if you're visualizing from the frequency of not having, the field reads that frequency and organizes accordingly. It's not giving you what you picture. It's giving you what matches your energetic signature at the moment of measurement. This is why detachment works. Not because you stop caring about the outcome, but because when you're truly detached, you stop measuring from need. You stop interfering with the wave function through constant anxious observation. You let the probability amplitude evolve without collapsing it every 5 minutes to check if it's done yet. Think about something you manifested easily, something that showed up without effort. I guarantee you weren't obsessively visualizing it. You weren't checking on it constantly. You probably decided you wanted it, felt good about it, and then went about your life. You observed it occasionally with neutral awareness, but you didn't measure it from desperation. And it appeared easily, quickly, perfectly. That's what happens when observation is clean, when there's no interference. The wave function collapses at the right time, into the right state, because your measurement isn't forcing it into survival-based outcomes. But for most people, most of the time, observation is contaminated with interference. And here's what makes this even more complicated. You can't just stop observing. You can't just never think about your goals or desires. That's not how consciousness works. You will observe. You will measure. The question is whether you can clean up the frequency of that measurement. Can you check your bank account from curiosity instead of fear? Can you look at your business metrics from neutral awareness instead of desperate validation seeking? Can you think about your desired reality from the feeling of "this is organizing" instead of "please let this work"? Because here's what happens when you measure from a regulated state. When you observe from coherence instead of chaos, the wave function still collapses, but it collapses toward the highest probability state available. It collapses in alignment with the field's organization, not against it. It confirms what's forming instead of confirming what's missing. This is the difference between conscious observation and anxious interference. One creates, the other destroys. And most people are destroying their timelines multiple times per day without realizing it because they think all observation is the same. They think focus on your goal is good advice. But unfocused awareness from a coherent state beats obsessive focus from a desperate state every single time. So here's what you need to track. Notice when you're checking, when you're measuring, when you're looking for evidence that it's working. And in that moment, before you perform the measurement, ask yourself, what state am I in right now? Am I observing from having or from needing? Am I witnessing from curiosity or from fear? Am I measuring to confirm the reality I want or to confirm the lack I'm trying to escape? Because the answer to that question determines what collapses into your experience. The field doesn't care what you want. It responds to what you are. And what you are is revealed in the frequency of your observation. Now I know what you're thinking. Okay, so I need to regulate my nervous system. I need to observe from coherence. I get it, and yes, that's part of it. But there's something deeper happening here that you need to understand. Because even regulated observation, even neutral witnessing, still interacts with the quantum field in time. And time matters, because your desired reality isn't just sitting there waiting to be observed. It's developing. It's evolving through something called phase space. And if you don't understand how phase space works, you'll keep collapsing too early, even when your nervous system is perfectly calm. Let me show you what I mean. Your desired reality exists right now, not as a manifested thing, as a probability amplitude in phase space. And here's what nobody tells you, that amplitude is growing. It's accumulating coherence, pulling in entangled particles, building momentum, but only if you don't collapse it. The quantum field has its own timing, and it's faster than forcing phase space. Most people have never heard this term, but it's the key to understanding why some manifestations feel effortless while others require grinding force. Phase space is the mathematical space where all possible states of a system exist simultaneously. It's not physical space, it's the space of possibilities. And in that space, your desired reality is already present as a probability distribution. Think of it like this. Right now, there's a version of reality where you have the income you want. There's a version where you have the relationship you want. The business, the health, the circumstances. All of those versions exist as probability amplitudes in phase space. They're not equally likely. Some have higher amplitude than others. But they're all there, all real in the mathematical sense, all possible. And here's what's critical. Those probability amplitudes change over time. They're not static. When you hold a possibility in superposition without collapsing it, the amplitude grows. It's like a wave building. Constructive interference happens. The probability literally increases the longer you maintain coherence with that state, without measuring it into fixed reality. This is why patience works when it looks like nothing is happening. The field is computing. It's running calculations you can't see. It's testing pathway after pathway, finding the route of least resistance, building connections between your current state and the desired state. And all of that takes time, not because the universe is slow, but because the organization happening in phase space is complex. Let me give you a concrete example. You want to triple your income. The moment you hold that possibility in your awareness without collapsing it into a specific how, the quantum field begins exploring phase space. It's calculating what skills need to develop, what connections need to form, what circumstances need to shift, what beliefs need to dissolve, what opportunities need to appear. And it's not doing this linearly. It's doing it simultaneously across thousands of probability pathways. Some of those pathways have low probability. They'd require too much energy, too much change, too much force. The field discards them. Other pathways have higher probability. They're closer to your current state, they require less resistance, they flow more naturally. The field amplifies those. And over time, days, weeks, sometimes just hours, one pathway emerges with significantly higher probability than all the others. That's the path of least resistance. That's what the field has been organizing toward. But if you collapse too early, you don't get that optimized pathway. You get whatever pathway was barely visible at the moment you decided. You force the field to work with limited options instead of letting it compute the full solution. This is why synchronicities appear in clusters. You go weeks with nothing, then suddenly 3 perfect opportunities show up in the same day. That's not randomness. That's phase space organization reaching a coherence point. The field was building those connections in the background. You couldn't see it happening, but the probability amplitude was growing, entangling with other fields, pulling circumstances together. And when it reached critical mass, it collapsed into your physical reality all at once. You've experienced this. You know what I'm talking about. That moment when everything suddenly clicks, when the pieces fall into place so perfectly you almost can't believe it. When the timing is weirdly flawless. That's not luck. That's what happens when you let phase space evolution complete before you collapse the wave function. But most people don't let it complete. They collapse at the first sign of possibility. They see one pathway forming and they grab it. This must be it. This is how it's happening. And they lock in. They commit. They force action down that one pathway. And they miss the fact that the field was organizing 3 other pathways that would have been exponentially better. Here's how you know if you're experiencing phase space evolution. You feel pulled towards something, but you can't explain it yet. Multiple pathways seem equally valid, and you can't tell which one to choose. You're experiencing synchronicities, small ones, but the full picture hasn't revealed itself. You have this sense that something is organizing, but you can't see the structure yet. That's not confusion. That's not lack of clarity. That's the field computing. That's probability amplitudes building in phase space. And the worst thing you can do in that moment is force a decision to relieve your discomfort with not knowing. The mathematics here are actually stunning. In quantum systems, probability amplitudes can interfere with each other constructively. When 2 probable pathways align in phase space, they don't just add, they multiply. The combined probability becomes exponentially higher than either pathway alone, but only if both pathways are held in superposition long enough to interfere with each other. When you collapse too early, you prevent that constructive interference. You take one pathway with a probability of, say, 30%, but if you'd waited, 2 pathways would have merged into one pathway with an 80% probability. The field was building toward that merger. But you collapsed before it could happen. This is why waiting for clarity isn't passive. It's not spiritual bypassing. It's not indecision dressed up as trust. It's allowing the quantum field to do what it does best, optimize across massive amounts of information you don't have conscious access to. The field can see the full phase space. You can only see a tiny slice of current possibilities. And when you force decisions based on that tiny slice, you're overriding intelligence that vastly exceeds your conscious awareness. Now, I can feel your resistance to this, because you've been taught that waiting is weakness, that successful people are decisive, that clarity comes from action, not contemplation. And there's truth in that, but it's incomplete truth, because there's a difference between waiting from fear and waiting from trust. Between inaction from confusion and allowing from coherence. When you're in a coherent state, when your nervous system is regulated, when you're not measuring from anxiety, you can feel the difference between not yet. Something's organizing and you're avoiding because you're scared. One feels like anticipation, like potential building. The other feels like contraction, like hiding. And here's what makes this even more powerful. When you can hold superposition without anxiety, you're not just passively waiting. You're actively participating in phase space organization. Your coherent state is part of the field. Your frequency is part of the calculation. You're not separate from the quantum system, you're in it. And the state you maintain while the field computes determines which pathways get amplified and which ones get discarded. A regulated nervous system creates coherent wave functions. An anxious nervous system creates chaotic interference, and chaos collapses possibilities into survival states. Always. So when you're holding that possibility in superposition, when you're feeling that sense of something's organizing, your job isn't to figure it out. Your job is to maintain coherence, to stay in the frequency of the desired outcome without measuring whether it's here yet. To be the stable observer that allows phase space to complete its organization without interference. But here's where this gets really interesting. And this is the piece that changes everything. Because you're not just a passive observer watching phase space evolve. You're part of the system. You are a measurement device. Your nervous system is constantly interacting with the quantum field, constantly measuring, constantly collapsing micro possibilities into experience. And that nervous system? It has its own agenda. An agenda that has nothing to do with your goals and everything to do with your survival. And that's the problem we need to address next. Every time you feel anxiety about the outcome, you just measured it. Every time you check if it's working, you measured it. Every time you tell someone your plan to feel more certain, you measured it. And measurement collapses. Your nervous system is performing thousands of micro-collapses every day. Let me be clear about what I mean. Your nervous system isn't neutral. It's not a passive receiver of information. It's an active measurement apparatus that's constantly scanning your environment and your internal state for threat signals. Is this safe? Is this secure? Do I have enough? Am I in danger? And every single one of those scans is a quantum measurement that collapses possibilities. In physics, a measurement device interacts with a quantum system and forces it into a definite state. Before measurement, the electron is in superposition, many places at once. After measurement, it's in one place. The measurement device determines when and how the collapse happens. Your nervous system works exactly the same way with your reality field. When you're in a regulated state, parasympathetic, coherent, safe, your nervous system measures from curiosity, from openness, from the frequency of let's see what emerges. And those measurements collapse the wave function into exploratory states, into possibility, into expansion. But when you're dysregulated, sympathetic activation, stress response, survival mode, your nervous system measures from threat detection, from contraction, from the frequency of confirm whether I'm safe right now. And those measurements collapse the wave function into protective states, into limitation, into confirmed lack. This is why stress destroys manifestation. It's not just because stress lowers your vibration, though that's part of it. It's because stress turns your nervous system into a measurement device that's constantly collapsing possibilities into survival-based outcomes. Your biology is literally forcing the quantum field to prioritize safety over expansion, scarcity over abundance, known over unknown. Think about what happens when you're anxious about money. Your nervous system goes into scan mode. You check your bank account. That's a measurement. You calculate your bills. That's a measurement. You think about how you're going to cover expenses. That's a measurement. You feel the tightness in your chest when you think about your financial situation. That's a measurement. And every single one of those measurements is collapsing the probability field from the frequency of lack. You're not observing wealth into existence. You're measuring lack into confirmation, over and over and over. Hundreds of micro-collapses per day, all reinforcing the exact reality you're trying to escape or take relationships. You want a partner. You hold the vision of the relationship you desire. But then your nervous system kicks in. You check the dating app, measurement. You scan the environment for potential matches, measurement. You feel the loneliness, measurement. You compare yourself to people in relationships, measurement. And what frequency are all those measurements happening from? Lack, not having, not enough. And the field responds by collapsing into continued lack. Here's what makes this so insidious. You can't just turn off your nervous system. You can't stop it from measuring. It's doing its job. It's trying to keep you alive. And part of keeping you alive, from its perspective, is constantly confirming whether resources are secure, whether you're safe, whether threats are present. That's not a bug. That's a feature of your biology. But it's a feature that was designed for physical survival in immediate threat environments. Not for quantum reality creation in a world where possibilities exist in superposition. Your nervous system doesn't understand phase space. It doesn't understand that constant measurement collapses the very opportunities it's trying to secure. It just knows uncertainty equals potential danger. Therefore, confirm, confirm, confirm. And every confirmation measurement from a dysregulated state reinforces the lack state. You wanted to create abundance, but your nervous system is collapsing scarcity. You wanted to create opportunity, but your biology is measuring threat. You wanted to allow the field to organize, but your survival mechanisms are forcing immediate collapse into whatever feels safest right now, which is usually whatever's known. Whatever's familiar, whatever matches your current contracted state. This is why people with trauma histories struggle more with manifestation. It's not because they're broken or because the universe doesn't respond to them. It's because their nervous systems are stuck in chronic measurement mode, hypervigilance, constant scanning, perpetual threat detection. And you cannot maintain superposition when your nervous system is collapsing possibilities every 3 seconds to check for danger. Let me give you a specific example. You're building a business. You have a big opportunity coming up, a potential partnership, a large client, a significant launch. Your conscious mind is excited. You're holding the vision. You're taking aligned action, but underneath, your nervous system is in panic mode. What if this doesn't work? What if I fail? What if I lose money? What if people judge me? And every one of those thoughts is a measurement from fear. Everyone is collapsing the probability field from the frequency of threat, and then the opportunity falls through. Or it happens, but it's disappointing. Or it's harder than it should have been. And you think something went wrong with your manifestation practice. But nothing went wrong with your practice. Your nervous system overrode it. Your biology collapsed the wave function into a protective outcome before the field could finish organizing the expansive outcome. The state you maintain determines what collapses into your reality, not the state you meditate into for 20 minutes in the morning. The state your nervous system is in for the other 23 hours and 40 minutes of the day. That's what's doing the measuring. That's what's collapsing your field. So here's what you need to understand. Nervous system regulation isn't spiritual work. It's not just about feeling better or being less stressed. It's quantum mechanics. A regulated nervous system can hold superposition longer. It can maintain coherence with desired states without constant anxious measurement. It can allow phase space to evolve without forcing premature collapse. Regulation changes the frequency of your measurement device. It shifts you from measuring, "Am I safe yet?" to observing what's emerging. And that shift, that's the difference between collapsing into survival states and collapsing into thriving states. You've experienced this. Think about something you manifested when you were truly calm, truly secure, not forcing, not checking, not measuring from anxiety. It appeared easily, didn't it? Almost magically. That's not because you did the manifestation technique better. It's because your nervous system wasn't interfering. Your measurement device was operating from coherence instead of chaos. But here's where most people get stuck. They try to regulate through willpower, through positive thinking, through choosing better thoughts. And none of that works long-term because your nervous system doesn't respond to cognitive override. It responds to felt safety, to body-based signals, to actual physiological change. You can affirm abundance all day, but if your nervous system is getting threat signals from your bank account, your living situation, your social environment, it's going to keep measuring from fear. It's going to keep collapsing from contraction, and your affirmations will do nothing except create cognitive dissonance between what you're saying and what you're collapsing. So regulation isn't about thinking yourself into a better state. It's about creating actual safety signals in your body. Breath work, somatic practices, nervous system co-regulation with safe people, environmental changes that reduce chronic stress. These aren't just wellness practices, they're quantum mechanics practices. They change the frequency of your measurement device. When your nervous system is regulated, it can tolerate uncertainty. It can hold multiple possibilities in superposition without collapsing them to resolve the discomfort. It can wait for the coherence window instead of forcing immediate collapse. And that tolerance for uncertainty, that's what allows the field to do its work. But even with a regulated nervous system, there's still a timing question. Because possibilities don't just sit in phase space forever. They evolve. They reach points of maximum coherence. And if you miss that window, if you collapse too early or wait too long, you miss the optimal manifestation point. There's a specific period where the probability amplitude peaks, where everything the field has been organizing reaches maximum alignment, and that's what we need to talk about next. Probability amplitudes aren't static. They oscillate, they build, they reach maximum coherence at a specific point in time. And that point is almost never when you think it is. This is the piece that nobody talks about in manifestation work. Everyone tells you to hold the vision, maintain the frequency, stay aligned. But they don't tell you that there's a timing function to quantum collapse, that probabilities have peaks and valleys, that there are moments when the field is organized and ready, and moments when it's still computing. In quantum mechanics, coherence refers to the phase relationship between wave functions. When waves are in phase, when their peaks and troughs align, they create constructive interference. The combined amplitude is much larger than either wave alone. When waves are out of phase, they create destructive interference. They cancel each other out. Your desired reality is the same way. There are moments when all the probability waves are in phase. When the circumstances align, when the synchronicities converge, when the field has finished its organization, that's the coherence window. That's when collapse produces the highest probability outcome with the least resistance. But most people force collapse before that window opens. They can't tolerate the uncertainty. They can't wait for the alignment. So they act prematurely. They decide prematurely. They collapse prematurely. And they get a fraction of what was building. Let me show you what this looks like. You're working toward a goal. Maybe it's a business launch, a career move, a relationship milestone. You've been holding the possibility in superposition. You've been maintaining your frequency. And then weeks go by with no visible progress. Nothing seems to be happening. Your nervous system starts measuring from anxiety. It's not working. I need to do something. I need to make this happen. So you force action. You collapse the superposition by making a decision, taking a step, committing to a specific pathway. And what happens? It's hard. It feels like pushing. There's resistance everywhere. And you think, well, this must be the path, so I'll push through the resistance. But the resistance isn't a test. It's a signal. You collapsed outside the coherence window. The field wasn't ready. The probability amplitude hadn't peaked. You acted from the frequency of desperation instead of waiting for the frequency of alignment. And now you're trying to force into existence something that needed more time to organize. Compare that to the times when things flow. When you take action and doors open, when you make a move and synchronicities appear, when the timing feels perfect and everything clicks into place. That's not because you did something different. It's because you collapsed inside the coherence window. The field had finished organizing. The probability amplitude had peaked. All you did was confirm what was already assembled. This is why patience looks like magic. Someone appears to do nothing for weeks, then makes one move and everything manifests. It's not that they did nothing. They were holding superposition. They were maintaining their state while the field computed. And when the coherence window opened, they felt it. And they collapsed it. And it looked effortless because they weren't forcing against phase misalignment. So how do you know when the coherence window is open? You feel it. It's a sensation in your body, a readiness, a sense of now. Not the anxious, I need to do this now or I'll lose it feeling. The calm certainty of this is ready to move. There's a difference. And your nervous system knows the difference even when your mind doesn't. The anxious urgency feels like contraction, like grasping, like time running out. That's your survival mechanism trying to force early collapse. The coherent timing feels like expansion, like natural momentum, like something pulling you forward rather than you pushing forward. That's the field signaling that the organization is complete. You've experienced this. Think about a decision you made that felt aligned. You probably knew it was time before you consciously knew why. There was this sense of completion, of readiness. You might have even tried to make the decision earlier and it didn't feel right, so you waited. And then one day, it felt right. That's not random. That's the coherence window opening. Or think about opportunities that appeared suddenly after weeks of waiting. The job offer that came out of nowhere. The client who found you at the perfect time. The connection that materialized exactly when you needed it. From your perspective, it looked sudden, but from the field's perspective, it was the culmination of phase space organization. The probability amplitude had been building in the background. Multiple factors were aligning. And when coherence peaked, the collapse happened naturally. This is why divine timing is real, but it's not mystical. It's quantum mechanics. The field operates on timing functions that optimize for maximum probability. When you align with those timing functions, instead of forcing your own timeline, manifestation becomes exponentially easier. But here's what makes this challenging. You can't see the timing function. You can't calculate when the coherence window will open. You can only feel it. And feeling it requires a regulated nervous system that isn't measuring from anxiety. Because anxious measurement forces collapse before coherence. Every single time. This is where trust becomes mechanical, not spiritual. Trust isn't blind faith. Trust is your nervous system's ability to tolerate uncertainty while the field computes. It's your body's capacity to hold superposition without forcing premature collapse. When people say trust the process, what they mean mechanically is let the probability amplitude build. Don't interfere with phase space evolution. Wait for the coherence window. And when you can do that, when you can maintain your state while the field organizes, when you can feel the difference between anxious urgency and aligned timing, when you can act when the window opens instead of forcing before it does, that's when manifestation stops being work and starts being flow. Here's how you recognize the coherence window opening. Multiple synchronicities appear in a short period. You feel natural momentum instead of forced effort. The path becomes obvious without analysis. Resistance drops away. There's a sense of this is organizing itself. You experience calm certainty, not anxious certainty. And the action feels inevitable rather than optional. When those signals appear, that's your cue. That's the field saying, I'm ready. The organization is complete. Collapse it now. And when you collapse in that window, you get the full amplitude of what was building. Not a fraction, not a shadow, the whole thing. But if you collapse before those signals appear, if you force action from anxiety, if you decide from desperation, if you commit because you can't tolerate not knowing anymore, you collapse outside the window. And you get whatever minimal probability existed at that moment, instead of the maximum probability that was still building. This is the timing secret. Not that you need to wait forever, not that you should never act, but that there's a moment when action creates versus a moment when action forces. And learning to feel that difference, that's what separates people who manifest with ease from people who grind with effort. But even this isn't the complete picture, because there's one more variable that determines whether you can even perceive the coherence window, whether you can hold superposition long enough for it to arrive. And it has to do with your relationship with uncertainty itself. Most people collapse early because they can't tolerate not knowing. And that intolerance, that need for certainty, that's what we need to examine next. Probability amplitudes aren't static. They oscillate, they build, they reach maximum coherence at a specific point in time. And that point is almost never when you think it is. This is the piece that nobody talks about in manifestation work. Everyone tells you to hold the vision, maintain the frequency, stay aligned. But they don't tell you that there's a timing function to quantum collapse, that probabilities have peaks and valleys, that there are moments when the field is organized and ready, and moments when it's still computing. In quantum mechanics, coherence refers to the phase relationship between wave functions. When waves are in phase, when their peaks and troughs align, they create constructive interference. The combined amplitude is much larger than either wave alone. When waves are out of phase, they create destructive interference. They cancel each other out. Your desired reality is the same way. There are moments when all the probability waves are in phase, when the circumstances align, when the synchronicities converge, when the field has finished its organization. That's the coherence window. That's when collapse produces the highest probability outcome with the least resistance. But most people force collapse before that window opens. They can't tolerate the uncertainty. They can't wait for the alignment. So they act prematurely, they decide prematurely, they collapse prematurely. And they get a fraction of what was building. Let me show you what this looks like. You're working toward a goal. Maybe it's a business launch, a career move, a relationship milestone. You've been holding the possibility in superposition. You've been maintaining your frequency. And then weeks go by with no visible progress. Nothing seems to be happening. Your nervous system starts measuring from anxiety. It's not working. I need to do something. I need to make this happen. So you force action. You collapse the superposition by making a decision, taking a step, committing to a specific pathway. And what happens? It's hard. It feels like pushing. There's resistance everywhere. And you think, well, this must be the path, so I'll push through the resistance. But the resistance isn't a test. It's a signal. You collapsed outside the coherence window. The field wasn't ready. The probability amplitude hadn't peaked. You acted from the frequency of desperation instead of waiting for the frequency of alignment. And now you're trying to force into existence something that needed more time to organize. Compare that to the times when things flow. When you take action and doors open, when you make a move and synchronicities appear, when the timing feels perfect and everything clicks into place. That's not because you did something different. It's because you collapsed inside the coherence window. The field had finished organizing. The probability amplitude had peaked. All you did was confirm what was already assembled. This is why patience looks like magic. Someone appears to do nothing for weeks, then makes one move and everything manifests. It's not that they did nothing. They were holding superposition. They were maintaining their state while the field computed. And when the coherence window opened, they felt it. And they collapsed it. And it looked effortless because they weren't forcing against phase misalignment. So how do you know when the coherence window is open? You feel it. It's a sensation in your body, a readiness, a sense of now. Not the anxious, I need to do this now or I'll lose it feeling. The calm certainty of this is ready to move. There's a difference. And your nervous system knows the difference even when your mind doesn't. The anxious urgency feels like contraction, like grasping, like time running out. That's your survival mechanism trying to force early collapse. The coherent timing feels like expansion, like natural momentum, like something pulling you forward rather than you pushing forward. That's the field signaling that the organization is complete. You've experienced this. Think about a decision you made that felt aligned. You probably knew it was time before you consciously knew why. There was this sense of completion, of readiness. You might have even tried to make the decision earlier and it didn't feel right, so you waited. And then one day, it felt right. That's not random. That's the coherence window opening. Or think about opportunities that appeared suddenly after weeks of waiting. The job offer that came out of nowhere. The client who found you at the perfect time. The connection that materialized exactly when you needed it. From your perspective, it looked sudden, but from the field's perspective, it was the culmination of phase space organization. The probability amplitude had been building in the background. Multiple factors were aligning. And when coherence peaked, the collapse happened naturally. This is why divine timing is real, but it's not mystical. It's quantum mechanics. The field operates on timing functions that optimize for maximum probability. When you align with those timing functions, instead of forcing your own timeline, manifestation becomes exponentially easier. But here's what makes this challenging. You can't see the timing function. You can't calculate when the coherence window will open. You can only feel it. And feeling it requires a regulated nervous system that isn't measuring from anxiety. Because anxious measurement forces collapse before coherence. Every single time. This is where trust becomes mechanical, not spiritual. Trust isn't blind faith. Trust is your nervous system's ability to tolerate uncertainty while the field computes. It's your body's capacity to hold superposition without forcing premature collapse. When people say trust the process, what they mean mechanically is let the probability amplitude build. Don't interfere with phase space evolution. Wait for the coherence window. And when you can do that, when you can maintain your state while the field organizes, when you can feel the difference between anxious urgency and aligned timing, when you can act when the window opens instead of forcing before it does, that's when manifestation stops being work and starts being flow. Here's how you recognize the coherence window opening. Multiple synchronicities appear in a short period. You feel natural momentum instead of forced effort. The path becomes obvious without analysis. Resistance drops away. There's a sense of this is organizing itself. You experience calm certainty, not anxious certainty. And the action feels inevitable rather than optional. When those signals appear, that's your cue. That's the field saying, I'm ready. The organization is complete. Collapse it now. And when you collapse in that window, you get the full amplitude of what was building. Not a fraction, not a shadow, the whole thing. But if you collapse before those signals appear, if you force action from anxiety, if you decide from desperation, if you commit because you can't tolerate not knowing anymore, you collapse outside the window. And you get whatever minimal probability existed at that moment, instead of the maximum probability that was still building. This is the timing secret. Not that you need to wait forever, not that you should never act, but that there's a moment when action creates versus a moment when action forces. And learning to feel that difference. That's what separates people who manifest with ease from people who grind with effort. But even this isn't the complete picture, because there's one more variable that determines whether you can even perceive the coherence window, whether you can hold superposition long enough for it to arrive. And it has to do with your relationship with uncertainty itself. Most people collapse early because they can't tolerate not knowing. And that intolerance, that need for certainty, that's what we need to examine next. You've been taught that uncertainty is the enemy, that clarity equals manifestation. But quantum mechanics says the opposite. Uncertainty is the only state in which multiple possibilities can exist simultaneously. The moment you get clear, you collapsed it. And you probably collapsed it too early. Let me explain what I mean. In quantum physics, there's something called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. It states that you cannot simultaneously know both the position and momentum of a particle with perfect precision. The more certain you are about one property, the more uncertain the other becomes. Certainty about one aspect creates uncertainty about another. They're inversely related. Now apply that to consciousness. The more certain you are about the specific how of your manifestation, the exact pathway, the precise mechanism, the definite timeline, the more uncertain the outcome becomes. Because by collapsing the how, you've eliminated all the other hows that might have worked better. You've locked yourself into one trajectory and made everything else impossible. But when you maintain uncertainty about the how while staying certain about the what, certain about the state, the identity, the frequency, you keep all pathways available. The field can optimize across the entire possibility space, and the outcome becomes more certain because you haven't limited the routes to get there. This is completely backwards from what you've been taught. Every manifestation teacher tells you to get clear, get specific, know exactly what you want, when you want it, how it will arrive. But that specificity is premature collapse. You're forcing the field to work within the narrow constraints of what you can currently imagine, instead of letting it explore the full range of what's actually possible. Think about it. When you decide this is how the money will come, this client, this project, this specific source, you've just eliminated every other possible source. You've collapsed the infinite possibilities into one narrow pathway. And if that pathway has low probability in the current phase-space configuration, you're going to hit massive resistance because you're forcing the field to manifest through a route it wasn't organizing. But when you stay uncertain about the how, when you hold, money is flowing to me without specifying the exact mechanism, you keep all pathways open. The field can route resources through the path of least resistance, through the opportunities you haven't thought of yet, through the synchronicities you can't predict. And the manifestation happens faster and easier because you're not blocking the field's intelligence with your limited certainty. This is why people who are detached from the outcome manifest more easily. Not because they don't care, but because their detachment maintains uncertainty about the pathway. They know where they're going, but they're uncertain about how they'll get there. And that uncertainty allows the field to compute optimal routes instead of being forced down predetermined paths. Let me give you a concrete example. You want a relationship, you get specific. I want someone who looks like this, does this for work, has these hobbies, lives in this area, meets me in this way. You've just collapsed the wave function into an incredibly narrow probability. You've eliminated thousands of potential matches who might have been perfect but don't fit your specific criteria. And then you wonder why it's taking so long, but someone else wants a relationship and they stay uncertain about the specifics. I want someone who feels like home, who matches my frequency, who's aligned with my growth. They haven't collapsed the how. They've stayed in superposition about the specifics while being certain about the feeling state. And suddenly opportunities appear that they never would have recognized if they'd been locked into specific criteria. The field has more information than you do. It can see compatibility factors you can't perceive. It can calculate optimal matches based on variables you don't even know exist. But only if you let it. Only if you maintain uncertainty about the specifics while staying certain about the essence. This is the paradox. Certainty about uncertainty keeps possibilities open. You're certain that you don't need to know how. You're certain that the field is computing. You're certain that the optimal pathway will become clear when it's ready. That kind of certainty doesn't collapse. It expands. It maintains superposition while directing the field toward the desired state. But most people can't do this. Their nervous system interprets uncertainty as danger. Not knowing feels like not safe. So they force clarity to relieve the discomfort. They collapse possibilities into specific forms just to have something definite to hold on to. And in doing so, they trade optimal outcomes for immediate psychological comfort. This is why manifestation is advanced nervous system work. It's not about visualizing better. It's about developing the capacity to hold uncertainty without collapsing into anxiety. It's about training your biology to interpret not knowing as opportunity instead of threat. When you can do that, when you can stay uncertain about the pathway while remaining certain about the destination, you're operating the way the quantum field operates. You're working with wave functions instead of against them. You're allowing superposition instead of forcing premature collapse. And here's what makes this even more powerful. Uncertainty is actually the carrier wave for information. In quantum systems, information propagates through uncertainty. The wave function contains all possible information about a system, but only when it's uncertain. The moment you measure and create certainty, you reduce the information content to one specific outcome. You collapse the full spectrum of possibilities into one narrow data point. The same thing happens with your consciousness. When you maintain uncertainty, you're open to information from the field. You're receptive to synchronicities, intuitions, unexpected pathways. You're receiving the full spectrum of possibility. But when you force certainty, you close yourself off. You stop receiving information that doesn't fit your predetermined outcome. You miss the signals the field is sending because you've already decided what the signal should be. Think about times when you were absolutely certain about how something would unfold. You had the whole plan mapped out, and then reality went a completely different direction, and you resisted. You tried to force it back to your plan. You saw the deviation as a problem instead of recognizing that the field found a better route. Now think about times when you held your intention loosely, when you knew what you wanted but stayed flexible about how it would arrive. Those are the times when magic happened, when unexpected opportunities appeared, when things worked out better than you planned. Because you maintained uncertainty long enough for the field to show you pathways you couldn't have imagined. This is the shift from needing to know how to being comfortable not knowing how. From certainty about mechanism to certainty about state. From collapsing possibilities through forced clarity to maintaining superposition through comfortable uncertainty. But uncertainty alone isn't enough, because you still need to act. You still need to move through reality and make decisions and take steps. And this is where most people get confused. They think maintaining uncertainty means doing nothing, just sitting back and waiting for the universe to deliver. But that's not how this works. There's a specific type of action that doesn't collapse the wave function. In fact, it expands it. It increases probability amplitude instead of forcing premature measurement. And understanding this type of action, that's what changes everything. Let me show you what I mean. You can act without collapsing. In fact, there's a form of action that increases probability amplitude instead of forcing premature collapse. But it requires you to move from identity, not from outcome. Most action is measurement. You take a step to see if it works. You make a move to check if you're on the right path. You do something to confirm whether you're getting closer to the goal. Every single one of those actions is a measurement, and measurement collapses the wave function into whatever state matches your frequency at that moment. But there's another kind of action. Action that doesn't measure. Action that expresses rather than tests. Action that comes from being rather than trying to become. And this kind of action, it doesn't collapse superposition. It amplifies it. Let me explain the difference. Outcome-focused action is measurement. You create content to get clients. You network to land opportunities. You take steps to achieve the goal. And underneath every action is the question, is this working? Am I getting there? Is this moving me toward the outcome? That's measurement. That's checking. That's collapsing the wave function to see if you're on track. And every time you measure, you collapse based on your current state. If you're in a state of lack while you take that action, if you're creating content because you need clients, networking because you need opportunities, you're measuring from deficiency. And the field responds by collapsing into continued deficiency. But identity-based action is different. Identity-based action doesn't measure the outcome. It expresses the current state. You create content because you're a creator. You connect with people because you're someone who builds relationships. You take steps because that's who you are, not because you're trying to become something you're not. See the difference? One is trying to get somewhere. The other is operating from already being there. One is measuring whether it's working. The other isn't measuring at all. It's just expressing. And expression doesn't collapse. It generates. It increases the probability amplitude because you're acting as if the reality is already true. You're not testing whether you can become it. You're demonstrating that you already are it. And the field responds to what you are, not what you want. Think about someone who's already successful in their field. They don't create content to prove they're successful. They create because that's what successful people in their field do. They're not measuring whether it's working. They're just expressing their identity. And opportunities flow to them naturally because their action generates a frequency of already having instead of trying to get. Now think about someone who's trying to become successful. They create the same content, maybe even better content. But underneath is measurement. Will this get me noticed? Will this bring clients? Is this moving me towards success? And that measurement frequency, that's what collapses into their reality. Not the content itself, but the frequency behind the action. This is why two people can take identical actions and get completely different results. The action isn't what matters. The state the action comes from is what matters. And if the action is coming from already being, it amplifies probability. If it's coming from trying to become, it collapses into not yet. Let me give you more examples. You want to be wealthy. Identity-based action is managing your current money the way a wealthy person would. Making decisions from abundance even if the numbers are small. Treating yourself and your resources with the care someone who has plenty would demonstrate. You're not doing this to become wealthy. You're doing it because this is how someone who is wealthy operates. Outcome-based action is scrambling for more, checking your accounts obsessively, making desperate moves to increase income, taking on work you don't want because you need the money. All of that is measurement from lack, and it collapses into continued lack no matter how much action you take. Or relationships. Identity-based action is being the person who's already in the relationship you want, treating yourself with love, creating the life you'd live with a partner, showing up in the world as someone who's whole and complete. You're not doing this to attract someone. You're doing it because this is who you are. Outcome-based action is dating from desperation, changing yourself to match what you think others want, measuring every interaction for signs of potential partnership. That's collapse from lack, and it creates exactly what it's measuring, continued lack of the relationship you want. The pattern is the same across every domain. Identity-based action doesn't ask, will this work? It operates from, this is who I am. And that frequency, that's what maintains superposition while simultaneously increasing probability amplitude. You're not collapsing into one narrow outcome. You're generating the field conditions that allow multiple optimal outcomes to emerge. This is what people mean when they talk about being the change or embodying the reality. It's not mystical. It's quantum mechanics. When you act from the identity of already having, you're not measuring. You're generating coherence with the desired state, and that coherence builds in the field until physical reality reorganizes to match it. But here's where this gets tricky. Because identity-based action requires you to act as if it's already true before you see evidence that it's true. And your nervous system hates that. Your survival mechanisms interpret that as delusional, as risky, as potentially dangerous. So most people can't sustain identity-based action. They try it for a few days, don't see immediate results, and collapse back into outcome measurement. This isn't working. I need to do something that actually gets results. And they go right back to action as measurement, which keeps them stuck in the cycle of trying to become instead of already being. This is why the internal shift has to happen first. You can't fake identity-based action. You can't pretend to be in the state while desperately measuring underneath. The field reads frequency, not performance. You have to actually shift into the identity before the action becomes generative instead of extractive. And that shift, it happens when you stop waiting for external validation to confirm who you are. When you decide that your identity isn't determined by your current circumstances. When you recognize that the person you're becoming isn't in the future, they exist right now as a frequency you can embody before the material reality reflects it. This is the part that sounds like spiritual bypassing but isn't. I'm not telling you to ignore your circumstances. I'm telling you that your circumstances are the collapsed state of your previous frequency. They're old data. They're the result of measurements you made days or weeks or months ago from a different state. They're not telling you who you are now. They're showing you who you were then. And if you keep acting from the identity that created those circumstances, you'll keep getting those circumstances. But if you shift into the identity that matches your desired reality and act from that identity consistently, the circumstances will reorganize. Not because you're pretending, because you've changed the frequency that's generating the collapse pattern. Here's how you know if you're in identity-based action. The action feels resourced, not depleted. You feel like you're giving from overflow, not extracting from lack. There's no desperation underneath, no checking, no measuring whether it's working. You're just doing what someone in this identity does, and the outcome is irrelevant to whether you continue. If you're creating content and you check the metrics anxiously, that's outcome-based action. If you create content and you feel satisfied regardless of the metrics because you're expressing who you are, that's identity-based action. One collapses from lack, one generates from fullness. If you're building a business and every action is calculated for ROI, for results, for proof that it's working, that's measurement. If you're building a business because this is what you do, this is who you are, and the results are a byproduct rather than the reason, that's expression. One depletes you, one fills you. The energy is different. The frequency is different. And the field responds to that difference by either collapsing into scarcity or expanding into abundance. Now you might be thinking, but I need results. I can't just act from identity forever without seeing anything happen. And you're right. Identity-based action still produces results. In fact, it produces better results faster. But not because you're measuring, because you're generating the exact frequency that attracts those results naturally. When you act from already being, you're not waiting for the reality to change so you can be the person. You're being the person which changes the reality. The causality is reversed. And that reversal, that's what breaks the cycle of trying to become that keeps most people stuck. But even this isn't the complete picture, because you don't exist in isolation. You're embedded in a field with other consciousness, other observers, other people who are also collapsing possibilities. And when you interact with those people, when you share your vision, explain your plans, talk about what you're creating, you're not just expressing, you're entangling. And entanglement has consequences, quantum consequences. The moment you tell someone your plan, you became entangled with their probability field. And if their field is collapsing into limitation, yours starts to collapse too. This isn't about protecting your energy. This is quantum entanglement. And it's collapsing your timeline. In quantum physics, entanglement is when two particles become correlated in such a way that the state of one instantly affects the state of the other, regardless of distance. Measure one particle and you instantly determine properties of the other. They're no longer separate systems. They're one entangled system. Consciousness works the same way. When you share your vision with someone, you're creating entanglement between your probability field and theirs. Your wave functions become correlated. And if they collapse into doubt, limitation, or fear about what you're creating, that collapse affects your field. Not because they cursed you or sent bad energy. Because you're now entangled, and entangled systems share states. Let me show you what this looks like. You have a vision for your business. You're holding it in superposition, maintaining the frequency, letting the field organize. And then you tell your skeptical friend. You explain what you're building, and they respond with doubt. That sounds risky. Are you sure that's realistic? Have you thought about all the ways this could fail? In that moment, their consciousness just collapsed your shared probability field into limitation. They measured your vision from the frequency of scarcity, and because you're entangled through the conversation, that measurement affects your field. You might not even notice it consciously, but your nervous system picks it up. Suddenly the vision feels heavier, less certain, more difficult. That's not psychological. That's quantum mechanical. You became entangled with their collapsing field, and their collapse pattern started influencing your probability space. Now contrast that with telling someone who holds your vision as already real. Someone who sees what you're creating as inevitable. Someone who responds from the frequency of course this is happening. When you entangle with that field, you're strengthening your probability amplitude. Their coherence adds to yours. Their certainty reinforces the superposition instead of collapsing it prematurely. This is why selective sharing isn't secrecy. It's not about hiding your dreams because you're insecure. It's about recognizing that every conversation is an entanglement event, and some entanglements amplify your probability while others diminish it. Think about the people in your life. Some of them, when you share something you're excited about, you feel more excited afterward, more energized. more certain. Those are people whose fields are coherent with yours. Entangling with them strengthens your wave function. Other people, when you share the same thing, you feel drained afterward, deflated, more doubtful. Those are people whose fields are collapsing into limitation. And entangling with them weakens your wave function, regardless of their intentions. This isn't about whether they love you or support you. Your mother might love you deeply and still be entangled in a scarcity field that collapses every expansive possibility into safety-based contraction. Your well-meaning friend might care about you and still operate from a frequency that measures everything through the lens of what could go wrong. When you entangle with them by sharing your vision, you're not just receiving their opinion, you're linking your quantum field to theirs. And their measurement of your possibility becomes part of your probability distribution. The doubt literally becomes a factor in your wave function. This is why some manifestations die the moment you talk about them. Not because talking jinxes it, because you entangled with a field that was collapsing into impossibility, and that collapse contaminated your superposition. The mathematics here are stark. In quantum systems, when you entangle a coherent state with a decoherent state, the decoherence spreads. Chaos is contagious at the quantum level. One disordered field can disorder multiple coherent fields through entanglement. And in consciousness, one person's fearful collapse can disrupt multiple people's expansive possibilities if they're entangled. This is why group consciousness is so powerful in both directions. A group holding coherent superposition together creates massive probability amplification. Their wave functions constructively interfere. The combined amplitude is exponentially higher than any individual could generate alone, but a group collapsing into fear or limitation, that creates cascading decoherence. Everyone's field starts collapsing into survival states. The collective anxiety feeds on itself through entanglement loops. And suddenly what seemed possible feels impossible, even though nothing in physical reality actually changed. You've seen this in group settings. A team working on a vision together, all holding it as real, and the momentum is incredible. Or a family system where everyone's entangled in scarcity consciousness, and every attempt at expansion gets collapsed back into the familiar limitation pattern. So here's what you need to understand about sharing. Every time you explain your vision to someone, ask yourself, what field am I about to entangle with? Is this person holding possibilities in superposition or collapsing them into limitation? Does their nervous system measure from expansion or contraction? And if you're not sure, there's a simple test. How do you feel after conversations with them? More possible or less possible? More energized or more drained? More certain about your path or more doubtful? Your nervous system knows who's coherent with you and who isn't. Trust that signal. This doesn't mean you only talk to people who agree with everything you say. It means you're selective about who you entangle with during the fragile phase, when possibilities are still building in phase space. Once the probability amplitude is strong, once the coherence is established, once your field is stable, you can handle entanglement with more chaotic fields without being pulled into their collapse pattern. But while you're still organizing, while the field is still computing optimal pathways, while you're maintaining superposition of something that hasn't manifested yet, that's when entanglement matters most. That's when one conversation with the wrong field can collapse weeks of coherence work. And here's what's really important. This applies to what you consume too. Every piece of content you take in, every news cycle you engage with, every fear-based narrative you absorb, that's entanglement. You're linking your field to the consciousness that generated that content. And if that consciousness is collapsing into chaos, fear, limitation, or survival, you're importing that collapse pattern into your own probability space. This is why protecting your peace isn't spiritual bypassing. It's quantum hygiene. You're maintaining the coherence of your field by being selective about what you entangle with. And that selectivity determines whether your superposition survives long enough to reach the coherence window or collapses prematurely under the weight of collective decoherence. So be careful who you tell. Be careful what you consume. Be careful what fields you entangle with. Not because you're fragile, because you're maintaining a quantum state that requires coherence to fully manifest. And every entanglement event either adds to that coherence or diminishes it. Now, we've covered a lot of ground. You understand why premature collapse is the problem. You know how phase space works, how your nervous system measures, how coherence windows function. You understand uncertainty, identity-based action, and quantum entanglement. But there's still one critical question. When do you actually collapse it? Because eventually you have to. The question isn't whether to collapse, it's when and how. And getting that timing right, that's the art of conscious manifestation. There's a moment when collapse is ready, when the probability amplitude has peaked, when the coherence is maximum, when the field has assembled everything. And at that moment, decisive action doesn't force. It locks in what's already organized. This is the distinction most people miss. They think all collapse is bad, so they try to stay in superposition forever. Or they think all action is measurement, so they avoid making decisions. But that's not how this works. Superposition is temporary. It's the phase where possibilities organize, but eventually that organization reaches completion. And at that point, collapse isn't premature. It's perfect timing. The question is, how do you recognize that moment? First, let's talk about what collapse-ready feels like versus what forced collapse feels like. Forced collapse feels urgent, anxious, like you need to make something happen right now or you'll lose the opportunity. There's desperation underneath, a sense of time running out. Your nervous system is in activation, pushing you toward action to relieve the discomfort of uncertainty. That's not readiness. That's fear trying to force early collapse, because not knowing feels dangerous. Collapse-ready feels different. It feels calm, clear, like something has clicked into place. There's no urgency, but there's momentum. Natural momentum, like you're being pulled forward rather than pushing yourself forward. The path becomes obvious without analysis. You don't have to figure it out, you just know. And here's the key, there's no anxiety attached to the knowing. It's not, I think this is it and I hope I'm right. It's this is it and there's no question about it. That certainty comes from your body, not your mind. Your nervous system recognizes coherence when it arrives. You've experienced this. Think about a decision that was clearly right. Maybe it was taking a job, making a move, starting a relationship, launching a project. You probably hesitated before the moment was right. You considered it, held it in possibility, but something said, not yet. And then one day, everything shifted. The decision became obvious. The hesitation dissolved, and you moved forward with clarity that had nothing to do with having more information. You just knew it was time. That's the coherence window opening. That's the field signaling that the organization is complete. Compare that to decisions you forced. Decisions you made because you felt like you had to, even though something didn't feel right. You pushed through the hesitation. You told yourself you were overthinking. You collapsed because waiting felt too uncomfortable. And what happened? Either the decision led to difficulty or it worked, but required way more effort than it should have. That's the difference between collapsing inside the window and collapsing outside it. So here's what to track. When you're holding a possibility in superposition and you feel the urge to collapse it, pause. Ask yourself, is this collapse ready or am I interfering? And check your body, not your mind. Your mind will always have reasons to act now, but your body knows the difference between aligned timing and anxious forcing. If your nervous system is activated, heart rate up, chest tight, thoughts racing, that's not readiness. That's your survival mechanism trying to resolve uncertainty. If your nervous system is calm, breath easy, body relaxed, mind clear, that's a different signal. That might be readiness, but there's more to it than just nervous system state. There are external signals too. When the coherence window opens, synchronicities cluster. Multiple confirmations appear in a short period. Doors open that were previously closed. Obstacles that seemed immovable suddenly shift. People show up at the right time. Information arrives exactly when you need it. These aren't coincidences. These are phase space indicators. The field has finished organizing. The probability pathways have aligned, and reality is showing you that the collapse moment has arrived. You'll also notice that resistance drops away. Not because you pushed through it, but because it dissolves naturally. What felt hard before suddenly feels simple. What required effort before now flows. That's not because you got stronger. It's because you hit the coherence window where the probability amplitude is maximum and the resistance is minimum. This is why timing matters more than effort. You can force action against resistance and maybe eventually succeed through sheer will. Or you can wait for the window where resistance drops naturally and succeed with flow. Same outcome, radically different energy expenditure. And here's what's beautiful about this. When you collapse at the right time, the decision doesn't feel heavy. It feels like confirmation. You're not creating something from nothing. You're acknowledging what's already assembled. You're saying yes to what the field has organized. You're locking in the coherence that reached its peak. That's what conscious collapse is. It's not forcing, it's harvesting. You didn't push the fruit to grow, you waited until it was ripe and then you picked it. The field did the work. You just recognized when the work was complete. But here's where people get confused. They think waiting means passivity. They think if they're not forcing, they're not doing anything. But maintaining superposition while the field organizes is not passive. It's the hardest work there is. It requires nervous system regulation. It requires identity-based action. It requires resisting the urge to collapse prematurely hundreds of times. And then, when the window opens, the actual collapse, the decision, the action, the commitment, that part is easy. It's not work at all. It's inevitable. It's like gravity. You're not making it happen. You're allowing what's ready to complete. So how do you practice this? Start small. Pick something you're working toward, something where you're feeling the urge to force a decision. And instead of collapsing, pause. Hold it in superposition for one more day. Check in with your nervous system. Are you measuring from anxiety or observing from coherence? If anxiety, regulate. Breathe. Come back to identity-based action. Remind yourself that the field is computing and you don't need to know how yet. Hold the what, release the how. Maintain your state without measuring the outcome. If coherence, pay attention. Are synchronicities appearing? Is resistance dropping? Does the path feel obvious? If yes, that might be your signal. That might be the window opening. And if it is, collapse it. Make the decision. Take the action, not from force, but from flow. And here's how you'll know you got the timing right. The outcome will feel aligned. It'll unfold with ease. It'll match or exceed what you were holding in superposition. And you'll look back and think, the timing was perfect, because it was. You collapsed when the probability amplitude peaked, instead of when your anxiety peaked. That's the art, not forcing collapse, not avoiding collapse, but recognizing when collapse serves the highest probability outcome and acting from that recognition. But even this, even perfect timing, doesn't guarantee the outcome you consciously wanted. Because there's one more layer to this, one more variable that determines not just when you collapse, but what you collapse into. And it has nothing to do with your goals, and everything to do with who you are when the collapse happens. Let me show you what I mean. Here's what nobody tells you. The wave function doesn't collapse into what you want. It collapses into who you are. The observer isn't separate from the observation. Your identity is the measurement device. And if your identity is still person trying to become, you'll keep collapsing into not yet. This is the final piece. The one that ties everything together. Because you can understand phase space, maintain superposition, regulate your nervous system, wait for the coherence window, you can do everything right mechanically. But if your identity hasn't shifted, you'll collapse into the same patterns you've always collapsed into. Here's why. In quantum mechanics, the observer affects the outcome. The measurement device determines what gets measured. And in consciousness, your identity is the measurement device. It's the lens through which reality collapses. It's the filter that determines which possibilities, become actual and which remain potential. When you operate from the identity of person who wants wealth, every measurement you make is filtered through that lens. And what does person who wants wealth measure? Lack of wealth. The wanting itself confirms the not having. So every collapse reinforces the identity of wanter, not haver. And the field responds by organizing reality that matches that identity. You visualize wealth, you take action toward wealth, you do all the practices, but you're doing them from the identity of someone who doesn't have it yet. And that identity, that's what collapses into your reality. Not your goal, your identity. This is why people can work on manifestation for years and stay stuck in the same income bracket, the same relationship patterns, the same level of opportunity. They're trying to change the outcome without changing the observer. They're trying to collapse into a different reality while maintaining the same identity. And it doesn't work because identity determines the collapse. Think about it. Someone who is wealthy doesn't try to manifest wealth. They just make decisions from abundance because that's who they are. Their identity is wealthy person. So every measurement they make, every financial decision, every opportunity evaluation, every interaction collapses through the filter of wealth. And reality organizes to match that. Someone who wants to be wealthy makes the exact same decisions, but they're collapsing through a different filter. The identity of becoming wealthy. And that identity, by definition, includes the current state of not yet wealthy. So the collapse confirms, not yet. Every single time, this is the trap. You can't manifest from wanting. You can only manifest from being. And being isn't something you do. It's something you become by shifting your identity before the evidence appears. This sounds like bypass, but it's not. I'm not telling you to pretend your circumstances don't exist. I'm telling you that your circumstances are showing you your past identity. They're old collapses. They're the result of who you were weeks or months ago. They're not determining who you are now. Only you determine that. And when you shift your identity now, when you decide, I am wealthy regardless of the bank account, I am loved regardless of the relationship status, I am successful regardless of the current results, you change the measurement device. And a different measurement device produces different collapses. But here's the test. If your identity is actually shifted, you won't need the external validation. You won't be checking constantly for proof. You won't be measuring anxiously to see if it's working. Because someone who is the thing doesn't need to confirm they're the thing. They just are. A wealthy person doesn't check their bank account to confirm they're wealthy. They know they are. A successful person doesn't need external validation to confirm their success. They know who they are, and that knowing, that's what creates coherent collapses that build on each other instead of anxious measurements that keep resetting the field. This is why the internal shift has to come first, not as a technique, as an actual identity transformation. You have to stop identifying as the person trying to get somewhere and start identifying as the person who's already there, not in external circumstances, in internal state. And when you do that, something shifts in how you hold superposition. You're no longer waiting for reality to change so you can be someone different. You're being someone different, which allows reality to reorganize around that new identity. The causality reverses, and that reversal is what breaks the loop. Let me give you the protocol, the actual practice that makes this shift real instead of conceptual. First, notice when you're operating from the identity of trying to become. It shows up in your self-talk. I'm working on becoming, I'm not there yet, but that language confirms the identity of not yet. And not yet is what collapses. Second, shift to present tense identity. I am someone who, this is who I am. I operate as someone who, not future, present, because the identity shift happens now or it doesn't happen. Third, act from that identity before you see evidence. This is where most people fail. They wait for the circumstances to change so they can act like the new identity. But the circumstances change in response to the identity shift, not before it. So you have to act as if the identity is real before reality confirms it. Fourth, when you notice yourself measuring, checking for proof, looking for validation, confirming whether it's working, stop. That's the old identity measuring from lack. The new identity doesn't need to measure because there's nothing to confirm. You already are who you are. Fifth, notice when collapse is ready. And here's the key. When you're operating from the shifted identity, collapse ready feels different. It doesn't feel like you're finally getting what you wanted. It feels like reality is confirming what already is. Like the external is matching the internal. That's how you know the identity shift is real and not just mental gymnastics. When you can do this, when you can shift your identity before the evidence appears, maintain that identity through superposition without anxious measurement, and collapse from the state of already being instead of trying to become, that's when manifestation stops being work and starts being recognition. You're not creating something new. You're collapsing into alignment with who you've already become. And here's what makes this powerful: the version of you that can hold superposition without anxiety, that can maintain identity coherence without external validation, that can wait for the coherence window without forcing premature collapse. That version already is the person living the reality you're trying to manifest. You don't become that person after you manifest. You become that person in order to manifest. The identity shift is the manifestation. Everything else is just reality catching up. So stop trying to collapse into what you want. Collapse into who you are. Become the observer whose measurement device is calibrated to abundance, opportunity, success, love, whatever it is you're creating. And let the field organize reality around that observer. Because the field doesn't respond to your goals. It responds to your frequency, and your frequency is determined by your identity. Change the identity, and the frequency changes automatically. Change the frequency, and the collapses change automatically. Change the collapses, and reality reorganizes automatically. It's not mystical, it's mechanical. And now you know the mechanism. You're not collapsing possibilities too early because you're impatient. You're doing it because you haven't understood what observation actually means at the quantum level. You thought holding the vision meant staring at the goal, but it actually means maintaining the identity of the observer who already has it. Now you know, superposition isn't waiting. It's allowing the field to compute while you maintain identity coherence. Collapse isn't forcing, it's confirming what the field has already organized. And the version of you that can do this, that version is already living in the collapsed state you're trying to force. Become that observer. Hold your identity in superposition while the field organizes the circumstances. Don't measure from lack. Don't collapse from desperation. Don't let other fields contaminate your coherence. Just be who you are. Let the probability amplitude build and collapse when the window opens. That's the quantum timing secret. Not when to act in clock time, but when to collapse based on field coherence. And the signal for that timing doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside, from the identity that's no longer trying to become, but simply is. You already are what you're trying to manifest. You just haven't collapsed into the recognition of it yet. So stop forcing early collapse. Stop measuring from anxiety. Stop identifying as the person who's not there yet. Let the field finish its work. Then collapse it with perfect timing, and watch reality reorganize around who you've already become.